Well, good evening, everybody. It's very good to see you all. I'm just going to start by saying I'm a little bit breathless this evening. I think it's going to pass quite quickly. It's nothing to be alarmed about. It's long COVID. I'm in no danger of anything. I just get breathless, particularly if I'm a bit anxious. I think it will, as I get going, I will calm down, which is normally what happens, and I'll breathe more easily. So I might take a few deeper breaths. I might speak a bit slower. If it doesn't ease off, Sadharaja, the noble being that he is, has said he will gamely step in and wing it. So thank you, Sadharaja. It's deeply comforting to know that that is the case, but I think I'm going to be fine. I wouldn't be trying to do it if I didn't think I could do it, but just to explain the huffing and the puffing. Okay. So this evening is the first evening in our series on what is enlightenment. And the title of my talk is Stepping into the Unknown. Can everyone hear me if I talk at this level? Great. So yeah, this evening we're going to be exploring the Buddha's life story before he gets enlightened. So up until the point that he's sitting underneath the tree. And maybe it begs the question, well, why would you do that? If we're looking at enlightenment, why would what happened before enlightenment be that relevant for us? Surely we're interested in the enlightenment bit, whatever that is. And I'm just going to read a bit from Bhante Sangha. Actually, that's reminded me. Somebody pointed out last week that we keep saying Bhante and not really explaining what that is. So just very quickly, so Sangha is the founder of our movement, our teacher. And a term of respect and reverence for a teacher is Bhante. I think it simply means teacher. You will often hear Sangha referred to as Bhante. So if I say Bhante, I often say Bhante Sangha actually, but sometimes just Bhante. That's what people are talking about. And just again to reiterate what Virajyoti said in the first half, if there are things that just don't make sense, or if somebody slipped into kind of a bit of sort of terminology that you don't really understand, please just ask. There are no foolish questions. It's very easy when you get familiar with it to forget, actually. So just ask. Yeah. So yes, why would we be interested in the life of the Buddha before his enlightenment? Bhante says, to contemplate the biographical details of the Buddha's early life is to be concerned not just with the spiritual path followed by a man who lived 2,500 years ago. It is to contemplate a path which one can follow here and now, a path that one is committed to, following if one is a Buddhist, if one has Buddhahood as one's ultimate goal. So another way of saying that was that if one has enlightenment as one's ultimate goal, we too can follow the path that the Buddha followed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell the story of the Buddha's life up until his enlightenment. And I'm very much using a chapter from Who is the Buddha, Sangha's book, Who is the Buddha, where he pulls out 6 points that he thinks are important to reflect on in the Buddha's early life. So really I'm following that model in a way, or the points that he's pulled out. 3 of them I'm going to look at in a bit more detail, 3 of them very briefly, because we don't have time to do them all. Okay. So, Siddhartha Gautama, I'm going to do my best to refer to the Buddha before his enlightenment as either Gautama or Siddhartha Gautama. Because obviously he's not a Buddha until he's actually enlightened. Buddha means the one who is awake. Before that point, he is Gautama. His family name is Gautama. It is said that his first name was Siddhartha. Apparently, historically, not true, got added later on as one of the many embellishments that kind of bring different bits out of the Buddha's life story. But you will very often hear him referred to as Siddhartha Gautama. So this is the young man before he is the Buddha, before he becomes enlightened. So he's born about 2,500 years ago in Lumbini, which then was in India, is now modern day Nepal. He was born into the Shakyan clan, and the Shakyan clan is a warrior clan, and his father is the head, the chief in this clan. He's born, and 7 days after he's born, his mother dies, and he's raised by his maternal aunt. And very soon after he is born, as was traditional at the time, possibly still traditional to do actually, the family consulted a fortune teller, a seer, if you like, to find out what the child's life, what's in store for this child, for this new life. And the fortune teller tells them that he will either be, the young Gautama will either be a great warrior and a great leader of the Shakyan clan, or he will be a great spiritual leader. And his father, very keen for the former to be the case, he wants him to be a warrior, to take over his role in the clan, decides to kind of keep him as happy as possible with that life so that he won't stray into the other one. And this results in Gautama having every luxury you can imagine. So he has 3 palaces, one for each season. He's surrounded by beautiful women musicians. He's got the finest cloth and silks that he wears. He's nothing but the best food. Apparently he's constantly shaded by a parasol wherever he goes, which I thought might actually be quite irritating. There's somebody just walking behind him with a parasol wherever he's going, so he doesn't get the sun on him or the wind on him or anything that might kind of disturb his equilibrium, I guess. He has no real responsibilities. He's married. He marries a beautiful young woman and they have a son. But the scriptures say, but the domestic life held no joy for him. And increasingly he starts taking himself off. I imagine him kind of wandering around in the palace gardens, kind of thinking, something's not quite right. Something doesn't sit quite right with him in all of this. And around this time, he sees the 4 sights. And just to begin with, I'm going to talk about the first 3 of these sights. So he goes, traditionally it's said he goes out of the palace with his charioteer, and he sees for the first time a man who is old, bent over with age, a man who is sick, perhaps lying in the street, very unwell, really suffering, and a dead person, maybe being sort of carried past him on one of those kind of open biers that they have in India. And he sees these things it says for the first time, and he's shocked. He's shocked. I mean, he must have been, in my mind, I think he must have been aware of those things. Even in the palace, there must have been the odd old person around, or a sick person even. But I think that it's the first time, because it's the first time he really sees it. He really sees it and realizes that it has implications for his own life. And I was just going to read a little bit from this. Point in the story. Oops. So the Buddha says, "Whilst I had such power and good fortune, yet I thought, when an untaught ordinary man who is subject to aging, not safe from aging, sees another who is aged, he is shocked, humiliated, and disgusted. And he forgets that he himself is no exception. But I too am subject to aging, not safe from aging. And so it cannot befit me to be shocked, humiliated, and disgusted on seeing another who is aged. When I considered this, the vanity of youth entirely left me." And he goes on to talk about the sick person. "I too am subject to sickness, not safe from sickness. And so it cannot befit me to be shocked, humiliated, and disgusted on seeing another who is sick. And when I considered this, the vanity of health entirely left me." And then he says, "I thought, when an untaught ordinary man who is subject to death, not safe from death, sees another who is dead, he is shocked, humiliated, and disgusted, for he forgets that he himself is no exception. But I too am subject to death, not safe from death, and so it cannot befit me to be shocked, humiliated, and disgusted on seeing another who is dead. When I considered this, the vanity of life entirely left me." I think it's very strong that the vanity of youth and health and life entirely left me when he really saw those sights. And I think maybe we can all relate to this in our lives. I was thinking firstly that feeling, before he even sees the sights, that feeling of discontent. You know, he's wandering around in his garden, he's got everything. He's got every luxury the sort of world can offer. And yet it's not satisfactory. There's still a sense of an ill-fitting cartwheel, it's sometimes called. You know, suffering is an ill-fitting cartwheel. It just doesn't quite work. There's something that's not quite right. And I think often it can be something like that, some sort of feeling like that, that can bring us to Buddhism, actually, to wanting to seek some other way of being, actually. I think that was the case for me. It was just it wasn't a sort of shocking moment, it was just a sense of just discontent and things aren't quite right. And then there are those moments when reality really hits us. You know, Gautama sees those three sights and it really hits him. The vanity of youth, health and life entirely leaves him. And I think for me, certainly one time in my life was when my mum died. I'd known people die, and people close to me, like grandparents, die, and I'd been very sad But there was something about the death of somebody so closely connected to me that really ripped out the carpet from underneath me. That's an expression. And just the feeling like, if my mum's died, I am definitely going to die. Like, you know, before it was that abstract, well, yeah, it happens to other people. It happens to old people maybe, or people not that connected with me. But my mum's, you know, she's just not around anymore. And that will happen to me too. And I had it's very strong, very quick, but very strong meditative experience of just suddenly being completely, I could see her skull. She was buried. So I was often thinking about her body, actually, not in a morbid way, in a sort of interested kind of a way. And then in a split second, it was my skull. And I knew in my absolute core of being that I was going to die. Like, really knew. Only for a split second, I'd say. And then afterwards, I was very shaken. But something was sort of blown quite wide open. I think those big experiences can be very shaking, but also really shift something. It's like, oh my goodness, I'm really going to die. I actually wish that realization had fully stayed with me, because I would be living my life very differently. But these things tend to close up again a bit. I mean, I'll never be the same, but that level of awareness certainly hasn't stayed with that closeness or intensity, I suppose. But it really hit me, and I do think at that point, for those moments, the vanity of life entirely left me. It was like, you cannot, like, I'm gonna die, and I might die tomorrow. You know, my mum was quite young when she died. You just don't know. You just don't know. And the other thing around my mum's death that really showed me something was she needed to leave her house very quickly to go into hospital, and she was never able to return. And so stepping into her house after she died was an extraordinary thing, because this whole life of possessions and all the things she had in that house that she'd kept over the years and had seemed so important, were absolutely nothing to her. Like, she wasn't there anymore. Like, they would have meant she'd just gone. And yet, you know, when she was alive, it was everything to her, those things. And suddenly it was just stuff, actually, just stuff. And it really again made me think, you know, what am I doing, you know, with all of this stuff? You know, you hear that expression, don't you? You can't take it with you. Well, that was a real sort of, you really can't. So what's the point in that? You know, it just brought up a lot of questions. And I think for Gautama, seeing death, old age, sickness and death, brought up a lot of questions. And he had this realization, and it's spoken of in terms of the ignoble and the noble quest. So the ignoble quest, he said, is looking for answers to the questions of old age, sickness and death within things that are subject to old age, sickness and death. And the noble quest, so, you know, within the palace, say, or within the sort of social grooves or roles in society. And he says the noble quest is looking for answers in that which is not subject to old age, sickness and death. And what does that mean? I think that's a good question. I think we will be looking at over the next several weeks what that means. But it is extraordinary at that point that the Buddha would even contemplate that such a thing was possible. because we have his word for it, but he didn't have anybody kind of saying that. He just had this intuition, and he realized that to kind of find answers, he needed to step into the unknown, to start searching in the unknown, beyond life in the cosseted palace. So he has this gut feeling that the answers lie beyond old age, sickness and death. And the fourth sight that he sees is a wandering mendicant. So a truth seeker, somebody who stepped outside of society, sort of wandering around with their begging bowl, looking for answers, looking for the truth, which was quite common in at that time in India. He sees this sight, he sees a sort of certain peace about this person, and he decides that's the way to go. So he decides to go forth. It's the kind of phrase that we tend to use. He goes forth from the palace, and he says, cramped is this life at home, dusty indeed its sphere. Life gone forth is wide open. So he leaves home. He leaves his palaces, his family. Traditionally, it's said he steals away at night with just his charioteer and his horse. He's stepping out of all that is familiar, all that is comfortable, in a certain way known. He's realised that answers are not to be found in familiar grooves or ruts, the sort of grooves and ruts of the group, or maybe luxuries, the distractions in his life. And we've had quite a lot of talk in Sangha Night recently about the group in its various forms. And we can go forth from all kinds of groups, economic, family, social groups. Gautama leaves completely. He leaves completely, although of course he returns once he's discovered the answers, and he teaches many of his family. Some people will still do that sort of big going forth today. I'm minded of Bhante Sangharachita in August 1947. You know, in a way, not that long ago. In India, he'd left the army, and instead one August morning, instead of putting on his usual clothes, he put on a saffron sarong and shirt that he'd dyed himself the day before. He'd given away all of his possessions. He destroyed his identification papers, which I find an extraordinary thing to do. He destroyed all of his, he burnt his passport. He had only the clothes he was wearing, one blanket, some books and notebooks. 1 week short of his 22nd birthday, he stepped into the unknown. And he says, thereafter, my life could not be the same. But he also said he had absolutely no idea what he was stepping into, or what that would mean, or that his life would never be the same. It was truly stepping into the unknown, stepping out of all of those groups, economic groups, social groups, just stepping out and walking out. And we may have less dramatic going forths than that, but they're still stepping into the unknown, going outside of the group. We've had a few examples of that, and actually I was listening to a talk by Jnana Vacha, so I wasn't fortunate enough to go on the retreat at the weekend, but all of the talks that Jnana Vacha gave have been recorded, and they're just great. So I've listened to the first two, and if you weren't able to go to the retreat, go onto the CBC at YouTube, the CBC YouTube channel. Those talks are there. So good. And in it, he's talking about something called the manas, that's within us all, that seeks identity, that grasps onto identities. It's a kind of innate thing in all of us. And we give ourselves the opportunity, when we step out of those groups and perhaps identities that we've created for ourselves, to really loosen those attachments a bit and to see them for what they are. So, for example, we had the New View team here a couple of weeks ago. They have all stepped out of career. They've gone forth out of career, from the idea of earning as much money as possible, into an exploration of exploring a different way of living and working. Unknown, actually, an ongoing exploration. Sometimes people go forth into living in community, so exploring a different way of living from the predominant sort of social society ways of living that we have. I was listening to a talk, I think it was Kama Shuri, I can't remember the person, but she was talking about going forth from gossip. She worked in an office that was a very gossipy office. She decided that she just didn't want to have to do it anymore. It wasn't, it wasn't something she felt comfortable doing. And she said eventually her colleagues just accepted she wasn't going to be a part of it and sort of didn't even gossip around her. But the thing that I found really interesting when she was talking about how it can bring out a separation that can be uncomfortable. So I think when we go forth from maybe groups, it can set you apart a bit, and that can feel uncomfortable. There's a sort of connection there by being part of a group that you're sort of joining in, and then you're taking that step out, and it isn't comfortable. It might feel very, well, actually in my experience, it feels freeing, and it feels much more sort of authentic in a way. But there is that feeling of loss that I think we all sort of may be familiar with it in different ways. And Bhante talks about how quickly we can regress when we go to visit our families. So thinking about families as groups, and how you can find yourself, well, okay, I'm going to talk about my own experience. So I sort of going along thinking, oh yes, I've made lots of progress, I'm much calmer and more aware and blah blah blah, and then I'd go home and visit my dad, and we'd play some kind of competitive game, and before I knew it, I was 10 and desperate to win at all costs. Me and my dad have a very, very competitive, and in a way it's a very small thing, but actually it really started to grate with me, because I was suddenly realizing that I was becoming this person that it didn't really fit with who I thought I was normally. And I've worked at it over the years to just try and take a bit of a step back and not be quite so involved in that sort of, maybe the banter and the kind of the real need to win. I mean, it's strong. It's strong. But I think the sort of reflection that I sort of want to take away from it is that it did feel like a bit of a loss to begin with, because actually it was how I connected with my dad. One of the ways I connected with my dad, even though actually it wasn't a very, there were all kinds of things in it that weren't that helpful, but it was sort of how we connected. So to kind of take that step out of it felt like a loss. But actually, in the long run, I just see my dad, I mean, that's one small example. There are plenty of other sort of interactions and ways of behaving with my dad that I sort of need to unpick as well. But I just see him more as a person rather than as my dad, who I really have to beat at all costs, otherwise I failed horribly in some kind of a way. And I can relate to him so much better these days. I'm not claiming that it's still not possible for me to go back into that space, because it completely is. It can happen very quickly, but I'm much, much more aware of it now. And just able to relate to him better. But I think there is that in that going forth from some of those grooves and habits, there can be that feeling of loss to begin with, certainly. So back to the story. So Gautama's left the palace on his horse with his charioteer. They get to the edge of the Shakyan land, which I find very beautiful. It's like the edge of his known world. The Shakyan territory is bordered by a river. And Gautama gets off his horse, shaves off his hair and his beard, swaps his clothes with a passing beggar, and sends the charioteer and the horse back. And it's another going forth from a sort of particular identity. I mean, if you can imagine this young man, by all accounts, very, very handsome young man. And I'm thinking he's got this beautiful black, wavy long hair and probably a very lovely coiffured, perfume oiled beard. And he's dressed in the most fabulous silks with gold thread. And then he shaves off his beautiful hair and his beard. He gives away his clothes. He's just standing there in rags. And he's gone from being somebody who you would look at and think, oh, there's somebody, you know, that must be somebody of status. And, well, in a way, you know, the kind of pinnacle of worldly achievements, really. He's got it all there. And he just becomes nobody, somebody you wouldn't even look at twice. I think that's quite extraordinary. And Bhante, when he's talking about it, he's saying, you know, he's gone forth from his social identity. He's surrendering his persona, which is a Jungian phrase, kind of his mask, his social mask. And I think only by making these sort of forays into going forth is we can see our attachment to things and see that they're of no real importance. I certainly think, you know, just on a I'm not a particularly fashiony type person, but actually if I had to get rid of all my clothes and just wear any else, like something that somebody had given me, I wouldn't find that easy, actually. I'm quite invested in what, well, I don't know what it is I look like, but, you know, there's a particular way that I look that I clearly think is what I want to look like, and it would feel uncomfortable not to have control over that or something, I think. And I was thinking about some of my own processes with going forth, and I got to a point where I wanted to get rid of some possessions, partly actually to do with the experience of my mum's house and having to sort all of that out. And, you know, with this realization that, well, I'm going to die, and this realization that someone else is going to have to do that with all my stuff. And I'm really not going to take it with me. I'm really not going to take it with me. Like, how important is this stuff? So I started with books, and I found it relatively easy to get rid of books. And I found myself thinking, oh, I've done I've made some real progress here. Like, I'm not attached to these books. I was quite pleased with myself. And then I got to my CD collection, and it was a very different story. And I realised, you know, I had CDs that I hadn't listened to for years, but I didn't want to give them up. And I was sort of saying to myself, oh, it's because they remind me of a particular time of my life, which was partly true. But actually, what I really started to realise, and this is quite embarrassing, is that my CD collection defined me in a way that I wanted other people to see. So when people came round, they would look at my CD collection and they would think I was a certain kind of person, somebody who was discerning or interesting in their musical tastes, maybe even was a bit cool. That was really what was going on for me. And when I sort of saw through that, you know, that is a persona, that is a mask, the persona that I wanted to project. I could let go a little bit more, actually. It's still a bit of an issue. I realised talking about a CD collection is so old-fashioned, but I've still got a CD collection. I realise a lot of people haven't. But yeah, the question is, well, what am I without that? What am I without that? But you know what? They're not coming with me when I die. They're not coming with me when I die. Someone's going to have to sort those out. So actually, how important are they at the end of the day? Okay. So Gautama is, back to the story, is stood with nothing of his former status, his wealth, his connections. He's on the edge of this river, the edge of the land. He turns and he steps into the jungle. He really steps into the unknown, and he is alone. So he meets with two meditation teachers. He masters their teaching, but realizes that it's not the answer. It's not giving him freedom, so he moves on. He practices austerities. He takes tiny amounts of food. He doesn't wash. He's incredibly good at this. He gets a following of people who really admire him for this. He does it for 6 years. 6 years is a long time. Bhante says it's like he's trying to gain enlightenment through sheer force of will, this kind of ego-directed effort. And by the end of this time, very graphic descriptions of the state of him by this point. You can when he touches his tummy, you can feel his spine. His bottom is a camel's hoof. His hair is all falling out and rotten. And it feels like it comes to an absolute head when, like, he's gone to the toilet and he's so weak that he falls over in his own excrement. And at that point, he realizes it's been a mistake. Imagine doing something intensely for 6 years and then being able to say, that's a mistake. That didn't get me anywhere. I think it's quite something. But how else can you discover the way unless you make mistakes? And we're all stepping into the unknown. And the very nature of that is that you will make mistakes. And it's very important for us to remember that. And then the result of him stopping his austerities, taking a little bit of food, cleaning himself up, the other 5 ascetics who are following him leave him in disgust. They abandon him. I think he's sold out. And Bhante says the something we can take from this is, if you have doubts, you have to be able to explore them. Others can't do that work for you. You need to be able to go it on your own if you need to. Like the Buddha could have thought, oh no, I've lost all my friends. I'm just going to I bet I'm going to carry on doing that. He was really looking at his own experience and had the strength to just say, no, I've got to do this on my own. And it reminded me of last week when Yanavarch was here. Darren asked the question, how can we be individuals within Triratna? It's a very good question. Bhante says, this is why I was reminded of that question, only if ready to be on one's own is one going to be ready to be a member of the Sangha. And then finally, we're going to leave Siddhartha Gautama. So he's taken a little bit of food. He's accepted help. He gets the rice milk, the little bit of food, from a passing goat herd called Sujata. He also accepts a freshly cut pile of kusala grass from a farmer nearby to sit on. And Bhante says it's really important to accept help when you're offered it. Enlightenment is difficult enough. Accept help when you're offered it. And so Gautama is now on his own. What he does is he finds a beautiful spot by the Naranjara river. He sits down on his freshly cut pile of kusala grass. I'm just very struck by the kindness of that image. He's taken this rice and milk, and then somebody's cut him this fresh pile of soft kusala grass. You know, he sits his camel hoof bottom on it. And I just think, oh, that must just feel so soft and gentle. And he sits down under a tree, near a grove of trees, and he is determined to discover the truth. And he says, let blood dry up, let flesh wither, but I will not move from this spot until I've gained enlightenment. So that is where we're going to leave him this evening. Talk about a cliffhanger. But I think we can see that he's gone through a lot. He's gone through quite a process to get to that point. And it's an extraordinary stepping into the unknown in search of the truth. And I'm reminded of, again, of Jnanavacha last week, exhorting us in a way. Enlightenment, spiritual progress, freedom is not to be found in samsara. It's not to be found in aging, sickness and death. We have to step into the unknown. We have to go beyond. We have to be open to exploring. We can't do it from the comfort of our armchair. It's challenging. We're going to have to take some risks. We're searching for enlightenment. It's another sort of consciousness, which we're going to be exploring in the coming weeks, and that the Buddha is on the brink of discovering as we leave him this evening. The Buddha's life story up to this point, it can show us maybe parallels between our own going forth and inspire us to explore maybe ways of going further. And if we can recognize, sorry, this is Bhante speaking now. If we can recognize in Siddhartha's story our own deepest strivings for ultimate liberation from the confines of conditioned existence, and the first steps we are already perhaps beginning to take in order to fulfill them, then we can also see that what Siddhartha finally realized is what we too can realize eventually for ourselves. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. We've got some questions. Actually, your group leaders have got some questions. I'll very quickly just say, if you want, I mean, explore whatever you like, but maybe look at what ways have you gone forth, maybe from behaviours or groups or possessions. What ways would you like to go forth? And another question, are you aware of your masks and personas that you present to the world? You might also want to think about what are your foresights, but that might be a bit much for the groups. So Jeremy will work his magic.